Artificial intelligence. It's a topic, a field, and a technology which, for all its promise, has continued to elude consensus, sufficient regulation, or in some cases, gender and racial parity. And yet, not only is AI everywhere, it's also contributing in great strides in healthcare to broaden access and enhance diagnostics. In our next panel, we bring together a group of passionate data stewards to muse the question of whether AI will or can be the great health equalizer. Let's take a look.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Access for All. Will AI be the great health equalizer? And today we're going to talk about artificial intelligence at a time where it's nearing ubiquity. We're going to talk about both the perils and promise of artificial intelligence. And today I have with me a great group to help facilitate and have that conversation. For us at Bear and G4A, we have definitely seen I think two trends around this topic. One trend absolutely in the political and regulatory environment, where this topic has gained steam over the last year to 18 to 24 months. And then on the business side, where a number of the companies that we invest in or that we do diligence on either have a very clear artificial intelligence value chain or they have an artificial intelligence stack. What we have also learned is that artificial intelligence has been in healthcare for about 30 years or so, and in part categorized by both artificial intelligence springs and artificial intelligence falls. I think this topic is also critically important for where we are today because artificial intelligence or these algorithms are all around us seemingly all the time, whether it's in our Netflix recommendations or whether we're on the street and we see an autonomous driving Tesla. We're now confronted with this technology in a completely different way. And this has, I think, a special context for healthcare. So to help unpack this conversation today, I have with me three very special people, which I will be happy to introduce. The first of which is Jennifer Goldsack, who is the executive director at the Dime Society. So Jennifer co-founded and serves as the executive director of the Digital Medicine Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing digital medicine to optimize human health. Then we have Lilly Pang. Dr. Pang is a physician scientist and product manager at Google Health. Her team works on applications of deep learning to enable better and more equitable care. Some of her team's recent work includes building models to detect diabetic retinopathy, predicting cardiovascular health from retinal images, and detecting breast cancer and lung cancer from screening scans. And last but certainly not least, we have Mickey Trapathi, who is the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where he leads the formulation of the federal health IT strategy and coordinates federal health IT policy, standards, programs, and investments. Mr. Trapathi has over 20 years of experience across the health IT landscape. So thank you in advance to our panelists, and I think we absolutely have the right group to have this conversation. And as we do, maybe we can kick off with just unpacking a little bit about artificial intelligence. What is it? How do we define it? I think in some of what I've read, there are no really agreed to definitions. And maybe to start, I would ask Jennifer Goldsack, where I think Dime has a great framework for definitions and what they mean in digital health and medicine.
Don, thank you so much. Yes, we do have, I'm very proud of a very robust sort of dictionary of definitions. For us, we see this whole field of digital health as being one of the most interdisciplinary fields that we can imagine, from needing sort of regulators to understand terminology in the same way that clinical colleagues do, in the same way that data scientist colleagues do, in the same way that our engineering colleagues do. And then critically importantly, the individuals and the citizen scientists we're asking to consent to using all of these tools, right? interestingly, for all of the work that we've done on definitions, the one that's eluded us a little bit has actually been around AI. And depending on audience, I will be very honest, I sort of flex the definition a little bit. When I feel like perhaps it's being overhyped, I'll reduce it down to reminding folks that AI is algorithms, and we've done math for a long time. We now just have increased computing capabilities and larger data sets. When we're having different kinds of conversations around risk of harms, around privacy, around security, often I'll lead into the definition a little bit more aggressively to really highlight some of the risks that those of us championing the field have to be eyes wide open to. So to some extent, a slightly flexible definition, I think, can be helpful in the context in which I just shared. In other ways, I think that people can pluck the definition that serves their purpose in a slightly more perhaps a less well-intentioned way. I want to be really careful and not sort of be accusatory here, but it would be easy to reduce something back down to algorithms if perhaps there were real sort of privacy risks or risks of harm based on interpretation of data to certain members of subpopulation, right? Oh, don't worry, it's just algorithms. To some extent it is and it isn't. And I think a flexible definition is actually really important, and understanding the full realm not only of what AI is, but any applications and the downstream impacts of those applications is absolutely critical. And I think perhaps the reason it's eluded our organization is because I think that a deep understanding of what we're actually talking about requires more than a one-sentence definition.
Maybe that's a good opportunity to pick Lily's brain a little bit. Around the Google definition, one of the conversation starters around this whole topic in algos for many years, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Jennifer, for kicking us off. And it's a pretty comprehensive definition. I think I agree basically with kind of nodding my head, agreeing with what Jennifer said. I think I love the sort of what are the implications approach of defining the problem space. So at Google, we generally think of artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning. A way to think about it is that this is really hard computer science. It's just, and we use this to solve a variety of problems for the user. And then there are implications of how we approach around privacy, around accuracy, around equity, and all those it kind of doesn't matter, if it's deep learning versus this other type of learning, because they're all just very difficult computer science meant to solve a problem. So I really love Jennifer's definition, and I agree. We also use it quite flexibly, and depending on the context of the conversation, we'll dive in a little deeper to understand the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches.
Mickey, would you want to add anything to that?
No, I was going to say, thank God you asked my two colleagues here first. That didn't start with me. No, the only thing I would add is, and I think that I think it speaks to a little bit to the implications that both that Jennifer was talking about, which is to say that it is a way, it is high octane pattern recognition and relationship recognition without any, and it's atheoretical, in the sense that it doesn't have, sort of causal constructs in it, which I think is a blessing and a curse, right? In a way, it's, the blessing is that you can unleash the power of computing to be able to sort of understand or see these kinds of relationships. But it is the curse is that people will draw really bad inferences from those relationships without appropriate context.
Well, Mickey, maybe that's a good jump off point, I think, to get into some of the meat around the topic. When you talk about causal relationships and unintended consequences, one of the folders that you're clicking on in my mind, so to say, is really around the potential bias for AI and for these kind of data sets, which I don't want to necessarily quantum leap directly there, but this, I think, has been one of the issues that's been in the public quite broadly. I mean, even through documentaries like Coded Bias and through a number of others. One of the lenses that we look through at Bayer and at G4A is through social determinants of health. So this construct for potential bias I think is really quite interesting to us, especially when we think about democratizing healthcare, which I know is maybe one of Lilly's favorite topics. So Lilly, I'm a little bit curious. I mean, in the kind of work that you do at Google Health or on your projects, how have you begun to grapple with this topic or with kind of these very large data sets at scale, and kind of work to strip away whatever inherent biases there may be in these data sets?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think so. We probably start less from the data and more from the problem that we're trying to solve and the people that that grapple with these problems every day. So I would say, for example, one of our pretty mature research projects is around diabetic retinopathy. So this is a complication with diabetes that causes blindness. The guideline around this is screening every year for people who don't already have disease. And the guideline is a little bit of a, kind of a worldwide guideline. And the interesting thing was when we first started, we wanted to make sure that we started in communities where care was needed the most, help was needed the most. And that's why we started with eye hospitals in India, as well as federally qualified health centers in the US. And start those people that we wanted to help the most. And so that's where we kind of framed the problem and then expanded from there. So I think, we can, the existing data you have for the most part will be biased because, these are the people who have presented to care. And I think that there are certain ways that you can help make a more useful product by starting off with the people and the users that you think will use it at the end. And then kind of try to build from there. Now that's a starting point. That's not an ending point. So you start off understanding the problems that you're trying to solve there, build an algorithm that actually solves these problems, not just any algorithm because you can. And then after you define that problem, there's a level of, okay, you build the algorithm, but then you have to then validate in the populations then you want to put your product in. So I think it's a combination of picking the people that like retrospectively may put you up in a better starting point, and then doing the validation to make sure that you're actually at the performance you need at the place, at the setting that you want your product to be in at the end.
Mm-hmm. This is really interesting. I'm curious, connected to that. I mean, you've talked about two interesting populations. You have India, which has been in the news quite a bit around COVID, as well as FQHCs, federally qualified health centers. So, I mean, I think the natural inclination when you talk about health and healthcare is how does a company like Google, and through the people lens, kind of gain trust to share that kind of information and to democratize it?
Yeah. It is a tough problem. I think, it is a little helpful, to be honest, that I work in the research arm of Google. And so in terms of, what our team does, we're really thinking about how to solve problems and have sort of a positive impact on this, whatever problem space the research team works on. So when we first started, it was definitely, kind of research driven type of endeavor. And so I think we started pretty small. We started with modest types of projects where it was pretty clear that, we would bring technical expertise on the table, but really it was our partners that taught everything about how patients access care and how clinicians delivered care and what are the follow-ups you have to think through. And I remember one of the first conversations we had with one of the directors, essentially, of a screening program that we had, and we were just so focused on, well, how do we get the algorithm really accurate? And he goes, no, Lilly, look, yes, like we can talk about the accuracy of the algorithm, but I do want to get in here and basically say, if no one follows up on your recommendation, your extremely accurate algorithm means nothing. And I was like, yeah, sure. But I want to build this really accurate algorithm. And he's like, okay, just humor me and look at the follow-up rates we have at FQHCs. And he basically told me a story about how the follow-up rates, even when they had, when they had human reads, right? It was 10%, 20%, and these were for people who were found to have disease. And he's like, look, yeah, your algorithm is 95% accurate versus 96% accurate, and you're going to put a lot of effort into that. But imagine if you could just raise the adherence rate for these patients, 10%, 20%, you would have done way more good. And so that was an interesting kind of perspective. And because of that, we started investing in what we call human-computer interaction, as well as ethnographic research, to understand what are the blockers downstream of whatever product we wanted to build that actually makes a difference in terms of patient outcome. And so we figured out essentially through this process that yes, accuracy is a really important aspect of AI algorithms, but the other aspect is often forgotten is the instantaneous nature of the results. And when you have an instantaneous result, you can do a lot with that information in terms of just booking the follow-up appointment at the same visit, or having the follow-up appointment in the same visit, or telling a patient, hey, you've been doing a good job with your blood sugar, keep up the good work, right? And a lot of patients never get positive reinforcement. They only get dragged in when something goes wrong, right? And so there are all these opportunities that we can build into the interaction because of the algorithm, being tuned in a specific way. And then we were able to sort of optimize for that and think about that as a part of the product development process, not just the algorithm itself. And so, we actually did a experiment looking at this where we used a human, actual intelligence versus artificial intelligence, a human in the loop that was able to give instantaneous results at the same visit. And we saw those adherence rates go from 10, 20% to 50, 70%. And all we did was give a same day result and then followed it up with a follow-up appointment, just the appointment. We didn't have the follow-up itself in the same day, just the appointment. And that increased follow-up rates like 3-4-fold. So that was really interesting insight. And a lot of the things that we thought were important, I think, when you look at the entire system, becomes one piece of the puzzle. So
right.
It's a hugely humbling experience to have people kind of lead you through that.
I'm kind of curious, maybe, and I see Jennifer nodding a bit because, you're talking about outcomes, results. You talked about kind of the start, as well as the starting point and kind of the ending point. And I know that Jennifer is hugely passionate about digital endpoints, especially in the context of research. And I believe the Dime Society actually has a digital endpoint kind of I don't want to call it an encyclopedia, but a community kind of a resource around digital endpoints. Jennifer, would you please tell us a little bit about those and how those fit into different research models or the work that Dime is doing?
Yeah, Dom, I'd be happy to, and I'll get to the endpoints library quickly, I promise. But I want to react to a couple of things that Lilly said as well. Mm-hmm. Sort of like music to my ears. I think you're exactly right, Dom. You asked the question around sort of building trust and credibility, and I think taking the time to make sure that we are solving for the right problem, and that this kind of technology is actually the right solution is critically important. How will we build trust, right? We can find plenty of signals. As Lilly said, we can build some tremendously accurate algorithms. What's the problem we're actually trying to solve for? And are they important to the clinical experts that we're asking to be stewards of these, new technologies, these new algorithms, these new approaches? And most importantly, is it of value? Is it something that the people that we're actually trying to help, do they see value in this as well? And I love the example of diabetic retinopathy, because we know that whether you are in India or sadly in most places around the world, the maldistribution of individuals who are at risk of losing their sight, like an enormous risk to them as a sort of consequence of their sort of diabetes, the maldistribution of those folks who need ophthalmologists to sort of be reviewing that data, and the places where those sort of patients and people exist, there isn't sufficient access, right? So how can we be a good steward and making sure we're triaging folks who really have needs to those physicians and making sure that they are able to maintain their sight, their vision, regardless of where they are vis-a-vis the clinical expert, critically important. And I think we've seen examples on the other side of things where perhaps that's backfired a little bit. A contentious area of medicine before we even get to AI is around sort of early screening for breast cancer, right? The use of mammograms, like some clinical practice guidelines have it starting quite early in the 40s. That's been that's not a well agreed upon piece of science. And yet there have been terrific bits of data science that have sort of gone after decision support there. But the question is that the right problem to solve for, right? If there isn't a clear sort of clinical indication, if there are concerns about potential harms, is that the right place to go? I think Lilly's sort of guideposts of, is this the right problem to solve for, is critically important. And I also really like, Lilly, how you touched on the idea of needing to test the algorithms in the patient population that we are trying to serve. And I think that this gets back to what's the second piece, in my opinion, of building trust and credibility. I actually think there's a good amount of education that needs to happen. And I'd be really curious to hear from both Mickey and Lilly about sort of your experience. We're chatting with folks in the community, and our DIME community are sort of arguably a really motivated, sort of passionate bunch of experts in this emerging field. There's still confusion about sources of bias and how you adjust for them. Doing some good education, both to the experts for a start, then the clinical users, and then the sort of broader population users, you can make statistical adjustments for biased or non-representative training data, right? That is possible. I've definitely heard people get very concerned. Oh, I don't know who's in the training data. To some extent, that doesn't matter as long as the test data where you move that forward is in the representative population. And given the voracious appetite of AI for data, recognizing that there are statistical accommodations that can be made, and then getting everyone to rally behind testing in the representative population, I think there's still a lot of education that has to happen there. There's confusion, and it's very, very hard to build trust when that confusion exists. So I think that's sort of a second piece, Lilly, just to sort of continue banging the drum as you were, around what can we do to make sure that the use of these tools, the use of these sort of digital data flows, the use of these new sort of computer science approaches are broadly used and are used in the right way, solve the right problem, and make sure that the field writ large has a basic understanding of what good looks like, so we can all pull together in the right direction. And Dom, I do want to come back and talk about the endpoints, but Mickey, I wondered if you wanted to react to that first before I do.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. I love this thread starting with, Lily's pointing out, are we asking the right question? And then you're talking about the trust and all the implications of that. And I think, and just to carry that forward just a little bit, I think it's a huge issue because, there's one thing that I think that we should all recognize is that every single model has bias, right? There's no such thing as unbiased. The question is, what is the bias important to us? What elements of it are observable versus not observable? What elements of it may be intentional versus unintended? And I know it seems weird to think about intentional, but let's remember we have lots of malicious actors. If we've learned nothing else from the internet, we know there are lots of malicious actors out there. So we shouldn't just, assume that that's not a problem that we need to address, at scale at some point as well. But it's introducing sort of a framework that allows us to build trust around those kinds of things that sort of say, let's be explicit about the fact that bias does exist. What are the areas that we're able to observe it or not observe it? What are areas that we're able to tolerate a certain amount of bias versus areas where we're not? And then to your point, are there ways that we can, use statistical approaches or other approaches as we do in traditional statistics with instrumental variables or whatever it is to, try to reduce, those biases where we know it's explicit. I think, getting back to the question of sort of what might be sort of more difficult areas of bias that are, somewhat, sort of structural in nature. In healthcare, for example, one of the challenges that we have is that we have terrible, and I'll just speak for the the US, I don't want to speak for another country. In the US, we have terrible outcomes data, right? We have terrible health outcomes data. We actually don't know what delivers good quality care. How will we know it when we see it? Do we have good longitudinal cross-sectional data to develop the kind of robust modeling that would allow us to be able to, make good judgments about what constitutes, good practices that lead to good outcomes? Now you start thinking about a world where we're applying algorithms to the practices that people are practicing every single day. By definition, 50% of those practices are below average. And without good outcomes data, you're asking yourself the question, what are those algorithms learning exactly? They're just learning what people are doing that may or may not be connected with whether that's leading to a good outcome or not. So those are the kinds of issues I think that we have to deal with as well. And again, I just come back to the trust and just an on the ground perspective. The trust issue in healthcare is just a huge issue. Providers, and I've talked to a lot of providers, and they have great concerns about the black box phenomenon, right? And we heard a recent story about an EHR vendor. This is not a criticism of the EHR vendor, right? Using certain training models that were developed by clients, developed in certain circumstances, had some bias associated with them that meant that they might not be applicable in other places. Again, this is not a criticism or casting blame. It's just to point out the complexity of this and how we need an overall framework for thinking about the applicability of these kinds of things and how we, sort of build trust in sort of the parameters and ground rules that we set around them, because I think that's the best that we can do is, sort of having those ground rules that people have an understanding of what it is they're using and where they're taking risks that they may or may not understand.
Dom, I'm going to pick up on something Mickey said, and then actually come back and answer your question about the endpoints library. I did promise we would get there. So, Mickey, I think you make a really good point, right? How do we even define what good looks like, right? If we're trying to create these things that point us toward a future state of better, like how do we even tease that out of existing data sets? And so, Dom, you mentioned Dime's crowdsourced library of digital endpoints. So for folks who don't know, when we think about an endpoint in the context of clinical research, that is the measure of whether you have been able to successfully answer your question. So in the context of a new drug being developed, if you reach your endpoint, if you achieve your endpoint, then you can sort of cascading from that, you can make the claim that, yes, my drug is doing what I say it does, and you may just make the decision to move forward to say, I want to get this new drug approved, for example. That endpoint is a measure of success or failure of your sort of clinical investigation. What we maintain at Dime is this sort of library of endpoints that are currently being used in industry-sponsored studies of new medical products. So that's drugs, biologics, and medical devices. And we launched this in October 2019, and we were beside ourselves. There were sort of 30-something digital endpoints, and 12 pharma and sponsor organizations were using them. And we were like, crikey, this isn't the stuff of the future. This is here today. How exciting. Fast forward, we just did our most recent refresh last month. We now have 207 unique endpoints being used by over 60, I think it's 66 all told, different medical product manufacturers. And this is quite staggering data when we think of the pace of growth. I don't think it's all good, though. And I think this harkens back to some of the pieces we've been looking at. First of all, on the positive side, I think it shows a maturity in our capability to sort of measure elements of individuals' experience of their condition with and without disease. It certainly shows a broader acceptance and an adoption by industry of these new ways of measuring health. Those are very positive signals. What gives me pause is that within those 207 endpoints, every single one of them is unique. Every single one. They span different therapeutic areas. There's 60-something different ways of measuring physical activity. There's 50-something different ways of measuring sleep. And while I certainly don't think there's one silver bullet way of measuring sleep, that's not appropriate. That's not, Lilly, going back to sort of the guardrails you set out for us, that's not the right way to solve that problem. Sleep manifests itself differently in different patient populations and different conditions. But, maybe 5 or 6, certainly not 50 something. And so my question is, as we are sort of using these new data streams, oftentimes from sensor technologies in this context, as we are applying new sort of, computing approaches to be able to derive information relative to health, are we solving for the right problems? Are we measuring the right things? And are we approaching it in a way that's sufficiently collaborative? So instead of throwing spaghetti at a wall, we're actually thinking, okay, let's pause. Let's do what Lilly suggested we do. Let's understand the needs of the patient population we're trying to serve. Let's listen to the needs of the care partners and the clinicians who also work with them. And then let's think about what we can measure. And then it's not a foregone conclusion that we use digital approaches, right? There will be cases where coming in and having a traditional lab test is actually the best way, and we might get other sorts of contextual information from a sensor. It may be that we want self-report as a supplement, or instead of. I think we need to stop making this assumption that because these technologies exist, they are de facto the right approach. They offer an awful lot of promise, but going back to being really, really intentional around what we're measuring, around what we're actually inferring from data is going to be critically important for the trust, the credibility, and also to better serve patients.
Where I'd like to go next along those lines, and with everything that was already said, is back to the ground rules that we were talking about, because actually, I'm looking here at Lilly's first example, between India, US, and we have seen, at least in the multilateral space, a lot of ground rules. So, a little bit opposite from throwing the spaghetti on the wall kind of take place. So, for example, the World Intellectual Property Organization, about 18 months ago, they wanted to know what people thought around, artificial intelligence inventions. We saw the US Patent Office follow suit a little bit. We've seen the World Trade Organization beef up its capacity and framework around digital. We see the World Health Organization, which is highly relevant to all of us, in June 2021, really begin to roll out its framework for artificial intelligence, which I pulled a few sentences from its report, which I think are hugely interesting. One, it says, AI holds great promise for improving the delivery of healthcare and medicine worldwide, but only if ethics and human rights are put at the heart of its design, deployment, and use. And then it says that systems trained primarily on data collected from individuals in high-income countries, for example, US, may not perform well for individuals in low and middle-income settings, like in India. And I think, my question in terms of ground rules and frameworks, especially because now for Europe, we see this legislative framework for AI taking place. There are public consultations open. What does this really mean, for data sharing? How can we share, kind of these ground rules? I think it's especially interesting that the US is starting to really, the European Union is looked at as maybe the Western world's leader on AI, and the US has maybe been trying to fill that space. And maybe I'll kick that question off to Mickey first. And absolutely, it's so relevant to what Lilly and Jennifer were already saying. So can maybe do the round turn like that.
Sure. So I can't speak to whether the EU is ahead of the US. Maybe some others can speak to that. But certainly it's and I think part of what you're raising, Dom, is a sort of a broader generalization of everything we've been talking about here, which is the question of applicability. How do we take algorithms or any models that are developed in one place and in one setting and apply them in others? And you pointed out the high income, low income division, which is just one of many kinds of distinctions that are I think really important. And again, it speaks to me to the importance of having some kind of context that that any particular model carries with it, so that the users have the opportunity to be able to understand whether that context is going to be problematic for them, and either decide that they're either not going to use it, or they're going to investigate it further, or they're going to try to refine it further, or they're just going to use it. But without that context, I don't really know how anyone can sort of think about how this will scale without getting tripped up in these general bias issues, as well as the ethical kinds of issues that you're talking about, which are hugely important.
Lilly?
Lilly, go ahead.
Yeah, Yeah, I think that Mickey points out a really good problem or issue is that there's kind of two ways that we think about validating an algorithm, right? One is like validating the algorithm in almost in silico, right? Like the accuracy and of the algorithm. And one of the things that we think about is actually to Jennifer's point, a validation test or a test set that actually has represents whatever population it is that you want to report out on. So the transparency of the performance of every algorithm and the transparency of what's in the test set, I think it's really important. It's kind of, I've heard of this before, it's kind of like the nutrition facts of an AI algorithm, where you kind of know what was used in training. And so one way to mitigate the consequences of bias is to be pretty upfront about what was used to make that algorithm. So that's one aspect of transparency and validation. And then, so you could say, hey, this was trained in, this algorithm was trained in these populations in the US. And then now we're going to try to now validate in a population, let's say in Thailand or in India. And that the second part is validation, prospective validation, which is pretty necessary, not just for the algorithm on a new population, but also the algorithm in a new context. So the example I'll give is, so actually the diabetic example, we started off saying, okay, we're gonna, you're interested in deploying and having clinicians in India, and we're also interested in helping clinicians at FQHCs in the US. There were some actually really interesting similarities, but there are also some differences between the two populations. So we trained an algorithm and validated in these two different populations before we even tried to do anything prospectively. An interesting wrinkle happened where we had the opportunity to deploy in Thailand, which is a different country, different context. They have a different kind of screening system, different kind of follow-up system, different kind of screening schedule. And so what we actually did was we took the algorithm and we validated against the national screening program in Thailand retrospectively, and then set up a series of prospective trials to actually figure out how this works and may need to be adapted in Thailand. We found some really interesting things in terms of the workflow of how care is delivered there, and we had to actually adapt the algorithm to get it to work for people there. So I think the two parts of, you're not going to get away from, hey, having a really transparent test set and some sort of prospective work to get the best mileage out of your algorithm.
Lilly, for my own learning, can I ask you a question there? Like in my mind, the sort of mental process there is the sort of the hypothesis that the algorithm will work well enough as you translate it into this other context of use. And I think that's exactly the right language. I really like that. And then you do the prospective testing to say, does it actually hold up, or do we need to make modifications? Because what we see is that in this new context, is that the approach, the sort of the hypothesis you're testing is that it still holds, and you are open to, through that process of prospective validation, that there may need to be tweaks and adjustments that are made either to the algorithm or in the way in which it's deployed and decisions are made.
Yep, exactly. So the two, both aspects of, are we going to change the algorithm and or are we going to change the way that it's implemented? I actually think, the interesting thing is that it's not just about the algorithm itself that does the classification of the disease. It's also, we also build algorithms that on-ramp to the algorithm that does disease classification, right? So you do kind of a data quality check and that sort of thing. And one of the interesting things for us was we found that, I'll give an insight from the Thailand trial, is that the image quality algorithm, which is the algorithm that feeds into the disease classification. We have a image quality algorithm that checks whether or not the image is gradable or not, right? So high quality enough to be graded or not. And in the context of, our engineers thought about it and said, well, I only want AI to give a result if the image is very, very good. Because if there's any blur, I want to kick this to a human. And so what we found was we were trying to implement this in the Thailand screening system where they had high volumes of people coming in. This high rejection rate actually destroyed trust right? Because people were asked to go hours, half a day to travel to a hospital for ungradable algorithm, where the ophthalmic nurse there said, well, it's a little fuzzy, but I could roughly tell that it's okay, right? And so the delta between what was expected and how the workflow kind of went there versus what the algorithm delivered, that experience, actually didn't build as much trust as we hoped in the prospective phase, which gave us a lot of insight into what we actually needed to do to tune, maybe this image algorithm, or add a human check-in, or something, so that we can actually build a system, the entire system, that works for that clinic. And this system might be AI only, but the system may be AI plus human. And a lot of times we found in these deployments that partnership with AI and human actually works the best. And these are things that you don't find, and you kind of think, well, if I had this algorithm and I was using it for my grandmother, of course I only want it to make a pronouncement if the image is like perfect, right? But I think if you think about now in context of what that screening system looks like, the answer sounds a little different. So
maybe we can. I feel like we've just really started getting into the conversation. But I do want to be mindful of our schedule today. So what I would suggest is maybe we put a bookmark here. I think there's definitely some opportunity for follow-up amongst yourselves. But I do maybe want to put a bow, at least a partial bow, on our conversation for today, and kind of bring us back to the original topic. So, access for all. Will AI be the great health equalizer? As you know, our ethos here is equity, access, and sustainability. And maybe in 30 to 60 seconds, I would ask each of you to kind of answer that question. Starting with Mickey.
Oh. Got it first.
Can't go last every time, Mickey.
No, that's okay. Well, I mean, I guess in the yes or no, it's like, well, no, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to get a lot of value and deliver a whole bunch of value above where we are today, right? I mean, I think the importance of of leveraging algorithms to be able to derive learnings that are meaningful to quality of care is huge. Not only quality, just service delivery and all the other aspects that we want to be able to have for anyone who's entering the healthcare system. And I think that the importance of it is that that right now we have such rudimentary abilities to be able to to do that today. And I think that especially in the U.S., at least, I can only speak for the U.S. The data itself is so complex and so messy that that the only opportunity that you have, if we sit around and wait for the data to be pristine, we're never going to get there, right? We won't be able to do anything. And that's one of the challenges that we have. So I think that the importance of being able to and that's even not even touching sort of the issues of the complexity of the data. It's really just a data quality issue. So a lot of what we're doing in the US, for example, by regulation from my office, is that providers and technology developers and health information networks, in a law that went into effect on April 5th of this year, are required to share information with other authorized parties, including patients, for them to be able to aggregate that information starting between now and end of October 2022. So just 15 months away, 16 months away, with what's called it's a structured data set, the US CDI, we call it, the US Core Data for Interoperability. But after that, they're required to make available all information that's electronically available in the medical record. That opens up the opportunity for algorithms, right? Because now we're basically saying at that point, we're not going to wait for standardized data. We're just saying, let's unleash the structured, unstructured, unstandardized data, and let's allow sort of the genius of analytics in the modern age be able to start to draw insights from that are going to benefit everyone. So I think it's hugely important.
And a reminder that we have not talked about privacy in this context. Maybe next we'll go to Jennifer.
Mickey, I'm really glad you brought up the recent sort of rule and regulation, and definitely congratulations for your office for pushing that through. I think it's incredibly important. Dom, it's a big question. Will it be the great equalizer? I think, my answer would be it has the potential to, and I think whether it realizes that promise or whether at worst, we actually make health disparities and health outcomes worse based on using these tools and technologies. Like, we are at that crossroads right now as a field. I think it's going to take all of us who are involved, from regulators to innovators, being incredibly intentional about the practices and about the decisions that we make over the next few years. And I think we've touched on sort of some of the key themes that we need to keep in mind during our intentional decision making. Are we using these tools to solve for pressing challenges, or are we just signal chasing? Really educating the field, all of us having a basic understanding of what good looks like when it comes to trustworthy, unbiased, high quality AI and algorithms in healthcare. And then there's a lovely turn of phrase that I've borrowed from David Shaywitz, and Lily, it's sort of reacting to what you were saying. All of your examples came back to the human engagement. We're not going to tech our way out of this. I think what AI offers is a very powerful new tool in the toolbox. It's not a silver bullet. It's about how the humans interact with them, whether those humans are the patients that we're trying to serve, whether it's the clinical colleagues, whether it's the developers of the algorithms themselves. There's an inherently human element here. The context that Mickey has mentioned time and again that we have to keep front of mind. We must be intentional about all of these things if we are going to recognize the promise of AI, which I think could go a long way towards being an equalizer in sort of healthcare and access to healthcare and health outcomes. It also poses enormous risks if we get it wrong, quite frankly.
Lily, last words?
Yeah, I don't know if I can say it any better than Mickey and Jennifer has. I think, like any technology, it is a tool in our tool belt. And I kind of think about, even the internet itself, right? You think about the democratization of information that happened so that, I don't know anyone who owns a set of encyclopedias anymore, right? And so it's great, and technology is great in some ways, but also on the flip side, now we have problems with misinformation. We have to develop tools to actually fight misinformation as well. And so the intentionality in which we implement technology will, have a huge effect on the outcome. Fundamentally, if you think about what AI can do, is that it can potentially reduce disparities in healthcare because of the maldistribution, the shortage of expertise. So it has the potential to do that, but many technologies also, if you leave it to market forces, it tends to result in, more care for the same people rather than better care for more people. And so I think, again, a huge potential here, which is for both good and bad. And so I think, building that intentionality into the product design, into the algorithmic design, and then into the oversight of the deployment of the algorithms, and putting in incentives that actually reward people for trying to tackle some of these hard problems. That's going to make the biggest difference in terms of whether or not we realize the potential of AI for democratizing healthcare.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Lily, Jennifer, and Mickey. I think what I take away, especially over the last few minutes, is definitely this context for intention along that scalability pathway, and that intention can either support or hopefully support this equity and access kind of framework. The incentives have to be right. And really, what I've really taken away from this session is the human element is still quite persistent, even when we talk about AI and really using data. So with that, thank you everyone, to our panelists and to our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.